After transferring your project onto your white paper, your next step is getting your kneaded eraser, and we want to remove any pencil smudges that might have occurred from the graphite. And if you have any areas that seem a little dark in terms of the outlines, take your kneaded eraser and just dab the surface just to make the edges a little bit lighter, because we don't want to have any dark outlines when we're shading. You're going to hear me say this later, but when we're shading, we're removing the outlines. So after you're done lightening up the outlines on your drawing, you're going to need the following materials. You're going to need access to your photo, because now we're using the values as a reference, so you can delete the grid. You will also need your hand blot, because we don't want to smudge any of our shading, so get a hand blot, which is a piece of scrap paper. You'll need your smudgy. You'll also need your blending stump and kneaded eraser. You'll need your 2B pencil, and if you want to, you can also borrow a 4B and 6B pencil. Those are optional. Because we're using our blending stump, we're going to need our sandpaper, and make sure you see Miss J for a smaller blending stump. Yes, they sell them in smaller sizes. You'll receive a smaller blending stump so you can do the blending on the teeny little areas of your composition. If you're ready to start shading, you can actually take your value scale. Remember, you have the real value scale where you have shaded the different values, and you can use your value scale. Refer to your value scale to help match the values. So if you're unsure how dark or how light to go, use your value scale to help you. Now with the shading, our intent is to create contrast and a variety of values. We are trying to copy the values that we can see in our photo reference, but contrast, right? We're trying to create contrast with the shading. What it is you're showing very light and very dark areas with the graphite. So this example here shows great contrast because there are areas that are lighter and they almost seem to pop out while the areas appear much darker. So we use contrast to help the objects and forms stand out from the background and to show a difference between the shapes and the edges. Again, we're not relying on outlines anymore. We're using the shading to show the edges. So you can see here with the background, this edge actually stands out because the background appears darker. Down here, even this lighter gray, it contrasts with this part of the background because it is darker. So you should be using a variety of pencils as well. Don't just stick with the 2B, but again, it's up to you. So your next step is getting yourself ready to start shading. For my demo here, I'm starting with this part of the wing of the crane, and this is what I have going on so far. I have to start pretty light because the paper is white, but what I've been doing is lightly shading, and I'm going back and forth with my photo. I had drawn some of the lines here on these edges, and so I am doing just some really, really light shading and then blending with a light pressure, because again, I don't want to go too dark. And if my edges start to get fuzzy, I can go back in with my kneaded eraser, but I still need to do some shading behind this wing here. So again, I'm going to come back, take a look, see what's going on there, and then making adjustments as I go. Right now I'm just using my 2B pencil because I don't want to go super dark right away. I can always go darker later. So remember, our smudgy is really great for blending larger areas. So once I blend the pepper and this box behind it, I'm probably going to use the smudgy. The blending stump is better for blending those smaller areas. Now also keep in mind, we're not shading any shadows. Okay, the shadows are going to be the very last thing that we deal with. Again, do not outline. We are using shading and contrast to show the edges of forms. So that's what I'm continually trying to do here. I do have to go back and look at my my example because I need to use that as a reference. But again, I'm always going back in and making tweaks, making adjustments. Now let me show you a couple shading examples here to give you an idea. So this has a really good example here of contrast. So this edge is lighter and then there's shading behind it. Same thing here. This has really good definition of edges and a variety of values. Also could use some more blending, but same thing, it's creating contrast. Now this photo looks a little dark, but we can still see the edges without referring to really harsh outlines. This is an actual student example. Again, we're not relying on outlines. So in terms of the background, depending on what's behind your form, you have to deal with something that we call back shading. This is shading, it could be light or dark values of the objects behind another object. So this is a seashell and there's a seashell behind it. So the back shading, it's a little bit darker in order for these edges to show up. Why do we use back shading? It creates a sense of depth and layering and also helps you avoid by relying on an outline to show the edges of the forms, right? Here is some back shading. This has a lighter edge. It's darker behind it. It's not creating a halo effect, but it's making sure that this object appears in front. We can even see it on these more complicated forms. This is this inside of a seashell here. And again, we have some back shading. We even have it on this type of shell. We can see it here. Again, it's not a shadow behind the shell. It's just a darker value to help it stand out. And if you're like, well, there's no object behind the other object, right? It's just the back of the box. Well, the back shading is the white of the paper. So again, looking at my example here, see this edge is darker, and then there is a little bit of a transition of value, right? But even notice here, this edge is white. There's some shading behind it. So a good tip is you want to start with the lighter pressure on your pencil, building up the values as you shade and blend. So shading is not just shade a bunch of things and then you blend and you think you're all done. It's not quite that simple. I am going in with my kneaded eraser just to lighten it a bit because I don't want to make it too dark. I can always darken it later, right? Keep that in mind. You can always make your values a little bit darker. I know right now this looks like a shadow. It's not. It's just in progress of working on the shading here. So I can't tell you how long it's going to take for each object when you're shading. It just depends on the complexity and the needs of the form. Again, we should be going back to our value scale, kind of determining, like obviously here, this part of the shading for this box behind this area of the box and this wing, it's a lot of values of 2 and 3. I will say it's sometimes easier to start with the areas that are lighter because it forces you to just start lightly versus starting with the darker areas. It is going to be your choice though. Again, if you kind of mess up your shading and things get a little fuzzy, don't just outline it thinking you're going to save it. You need to actually blend and shade right on the edge of the form and then go ahead and blend it with your blending stump or your smudgy. Now, something you do need to watch out for when you're shading are called embossed lines. These are lines that look a little ghostly. You will find embossed lines when you're shading and you suddenly see these ghostly lines behind it. So I'm going to intentionally make an example. I'm going to go somewhere where I'm going to actually make it darker. So I made an indent. The indent in the paper comes from the graphite transfer. That just happens. So let me show you where this one is. So I'm going to just shade. Again, I'm doing this just to demonstrate. I'm going to blend, blend, blend. Now, do you see those little white lines? Those are the embossed lines. You cannot get rid of them because they are permanent indents inside the paper. The only thing you can do is hide them. So for me to hide them, I'm going to have to shade like right on top of them Luckily, this object is going to be darker. I believe it's the leaf. Yeah, it's going to be a lot darker, so I can actually fix that later. Now, if you're continually shading and you notice that you just did a really, really dark value, like you realized you went way too dark, you do not need to start over, okay? Don't think I need to get a new piece of paper and I need to start over. Like, for example, I realize I'm going a little too dark here, right? I want to just blend this to get this part all blended, right? I want to just get this done so I can show you what to do. So like I realized this whole section here, again, zooming out, this whole section is the bottom part of this form, and I realized I went too dark. I just got carried away and I went a little too dark, and sometimes that happens. We just start to lose some focus of what we're doing. Your kneaded eraser is going to help you so much. Now be aware that your blending stumps, even the small ones, they can only do so much, okay? They're not going to solve all your problems, and it is possible to over blend your paper. Your paper is just fibers woven together, and so at some point it can only take so much abuse. So just a quick recap, and we'll just use some of this example here. This part of the shading got a little bit into trouble. It's a little too fuzzy, so they probably should have crispened it up. That's a big thing you're going to hear me tell you. Make sure your shading is crisp. So a quick recap. Start with the lighter pressure of your pencil and then build up the values as you shade and blend. Do not outline. We're using shading and contrast to show the edges of the forms. If I see you outlining, I'm probably going to try to stop you and send you in the right direction. Again, no shadows. Shadows are going to be last, okay? So shadows are the very last thing. If you're kind of stumped when you're shading and you're just not sure how to progress, look at your example. Also, go find the actual object. Take a look at it, put it in the light box, see what the edges look like. You can also just take a photo of the object on your own with your phone and refer to that single object on its own. Good luck.